So let me just give an outline in terms of how my presentation is going to be like. First of all, I'm just going to start by positing my argument. Then I'll give an analysis in terms of what defines my understanding, looking more at the contemporary issues. Then from there, I'll try to give broader propositions in terms of how civil society should move forward. But note that I might disappoint some of you because I intend to give more of the frameworks and the logics rather than the details, because I'm not here to actually develop the programs. So my conclusion is that civil society must be driven by the logic to transform rather than the logic to power, if it is to play an effective role in shaping an agenda for transformation in Zimbabwe at this historical juncture. This is because one of the fundamental problems facing Zimbabwe today is that the will to power has triumphed over the will to transform. Most actors, if you look around in political parties, civil society, and government, tend to follow this similar political logic. By the will to power, I mean the corruption of the politics, leading to the triumph in the Zimbabwean society of a logic to grab, conquer, and retain power for the sake of it. Contrarily, by the will to transform, I talk of a reflection to the logic to sustainably transform the embedded extractive political and economic institutions entrenched in state and society today. You know, my argument that the will to power has triumphed, it has some historical justification. Let me just talk a bit about it. You know, the reconstruction and resurgence of civil society, which happened around the year 2000, thereabout, you know, it happened in the context of serious contestations of state power. Remember, this is when Zimbabwe had a very broad national opposition political party in the name of the Movement for Democratic Change, which was very popular. And around that time, the logic was that the MDC was quickly going to wrestle state power from the government of President Robert Mugabe, and thereafter set in motion a transformational train. But this did not happen. Dr. Kanyenze, you spoke about the late 1990s when civil society was still driven by transformative ideas, the beyond ISAP ideas, the Constitution, and so forth. I think Brian Goro can attest to this. But my argument today is that when it came to 2000, and when that decision was consciously made by civil society to form an opposition political party as a vehicle to grab state power and set in transformation in motion, then you started sort of psyching the nation towards that logic to power. Let me just give the ramifications or in terms of this domination of the will to power. Or in other words, why I say the will to power has dominated on the national body politic. And I think this is important because we need to be able to understand the context, because civil society does not operate outside the context. We also need to get the analysis correct, because if we jump to treatment without proper diagnosis, that might result in problems. So I'll just quickly run through 10 consequences that justify why the will to power has dominated at this historic juncture in Zimbabwe. First, I think the consequence of the will to power has been the clouding of the transitional analysis itself. When you use power lens, every general election that does not result in a change of government is emotionally analyzed as the end of the transition. That is political paralysis in my view. Consequently, this is then followed by a period of activism recession, characterized by deflation of energies, lack of clear direction, donor fatigue, and cannibalism. You see, activists start focusing on destroying each other and their own movements. There's no more leveraging on the alliances, on the associations, on the networks. This is precisely the situation that civil society is in post-2013. Yet, when you try to use the transformative lens, you are bound to understand that transforming extractive political and economic institutions entrenched since the establishment of colonial rule in the 1890s is no easy walk to freedom. You begin to understand the situation is typical of a prolonged transition to democracy, which is usually characterized by one step forward and two steps back. You know, the path to transform, as history has shown, be it from Europe, North America, South America, has always been slow and long-winded, taking a century in some cases. But it eventually produced robust, inclusive, democratic and economic institutions. Zimbabwe cannot always be ahistorical, I emphasize. The second, the corruption of the political has resulted in an electoral crisis. You know, the fetishism of power in which President Mugabe and ZANU-PF believe they are the sovereign center of political power and are ordained to rule forever. And elections are now a mere ritual to justify the rule of ZANU-PF for eternity, as the results are always contested by participants. I think Dr. Ibo Mandaza, just before the 2013 elections, was arguing that maybe Zimbabwe should ban elections altogether. I think you remember. Then the third aspect is that this cultural domination of the will to power has led to citizen disengagement. I think those who work in civil society can testify that they've witnessed some form of citizen disengagement as they try to mobilize. I think this is partly because the daily weight to seek power, which is imposed by civil society and political parties, is too heavy a daily cross for the ordinary citizen's shoulder. And fourth, this will to power has resulted in some civic organizations being intricately embedded in the party politics. You know, you can tell whether some of the civil society organizations are embedded in the PDP, in MDCT, in MDC, or in ZANU-PF. And when you have this situation, the democracy and economic prosperity that we seek become embedded in party politics of power, and this becomes problematic. I think those who are students of mathematics, I'm not a student of STEM, would know that if you have an object P, let's say, which is embedded in another object Z, such a P simply is a subgroup of that Z. I think this is where my mathematics end. You should forgive me. Fifth, the will to power has also resulted in factionalism cancer. The very fact that ZANU-PF, the MDCs, and some civil society organizations are rocked by fierce factionalism, which threatens to tear their foundational fabric, is a clear manifestation that most key actors follow a similar political logic of the will to power. Those with power, as Brian Kagoro was saying earlier in the day, are not willing to let go and are bent to consolidate by any means necessary. But those without power are also not willing to take the long historical path of transforming the extractive and undemocratic economic and political institutions around them. 6, this logic to power has also shaped the economic institutions to benefit the narrow ruling elite so as to sustain the regime in power. I think Dr. Kanyenze exhausted this. I'll just explain on it. This has resulted in these perverse extractive economic institutions that we were talking about. Because when these people have power, they set up economic institutions that enrich themselves and augment their power. And they even use those economic institutions to corrupt the state security forces. And this results on all those kinds of accumulation that we were talking about. I wouldn't want to get into the theories as they've been exhausted earlier on. So in this economic malaise, this modality of accessing ownership and distribution of state resources is largely dominated by this party-state patronage. And 7, the cultural domination of the will to power, has also led to wafer-thin debate on succession. This is the context that civil society is operating in. For example, I think if you look at all the headlines, they are constructed along this Machiavellian political calculations and even gossip. You look at the newspapers, if you want to see how wafer-thin the transformative ideation is, you get headlines like Mujuri Conrad, Mnangagwa on the ropes, G40 fights back, Tim Lacosta guns for Moyo, Minister stole underwear. I did not steal underwear, Minister. You will die. Grace Ally wants Mnangagwa. Stop it, to mention a few. Even new words have been invented to capture the psycho power moment, like successionists. And some words have been flogged from the Victorian graveyard. These words, with no transformative value to society, are celebrated as defining our future. Up to now, I know little about the transformative agenda of these warring factions. There are no robust arguments on policies and ideas to move society forward. Number 8, the logic to power has resulted in a huge accountability gap. When the logic to power has prevailed in the day-to-day thinking of society, the citizen becomes a subject. And the wielders of power, they have the leeway to do what they want. In this interregnum, there is a dearth of public and institutional accountability, signifying the breakdown of the rule of law. 9th, the domination of the power logic has contributed to the constitutional limbo. The state has deliberately ignored those hard clauses that has to do with transforming the extractive political and economic institutions. And it has just settled on the soft issues. For example, you talk about devolution. It is in my view that we'll get to the next general election without devolution having been implemented, because it's talking about sharing power, and the regime wants to maintain power. And the final ramification that shows that the logic of power has prevailed, the context in which civil society is operating, and civil society is also part of, is that this power control game has resulted in polarization. Never mind about the polarization between political parties, which is far too obvious. The power control game has been manipulated to result in a rupture between the socio-economic and political and civil rights in national discourse. National issues are framed in narrow and parochial partisan interests, like land reform and civil liberties. For example, fast-track land reform is devised as a strategy to strengthening the ruling party's hegemonic domination, Dr. Kanyenze. I think its transformative nature only becomes a byproduct of power. And civil liberties, on the other hand, are defined as a part of a Western-driven regime change agenda. Yet the liberation struggle was also about civil liberties too. And even our own rich cultural history, we have always celebrated civil liberties. So given these 10 manifestations of the corruption of the political, I think civil society needs to rethink what strategies can be able to transform society, gender relations, culture, and nation. I think civil society programming must be driven first and foremost by the will to transform. That is, to advance the life of the community and of citizens, to improve political consciousness and quality of livelihoods. In addition, citizen engagement theories that mainstream gender must inform civil society programming and how they are going to shape society, rather than theories of elite change. In a context where part of national problem is located in the will to power, it is most unlikely that change will come from above, but rather from below. And within this paradigm, political and economic questions must be addressed concurrently in programming. The issues of natural resource governance to avoid extractive economic institutions is key. This rupture between redistribution and civil liberties must be bridged for sustainable transformation. Addressing one without the other will just be building on quicksand, and manipulations of such national issues for parochial partisan interests are not going to be helpful. But let me say, one other imminent task for civil society is to play a proactive role in nation building and remaking the state through giving life to the Constitution as a way to build inclusive economic and political institutions. Civil society fought so hard that the current Constitution, it has all these institutions that should be there to support economic progress, to support democratization. But now the challenge is to give life to that Constitution. And note that this is not an elite exercise, but requires mobilization of masses across diverse populations, not just the like-minded groups as we might be in this room. But we need to be engaging the new emerging social bases. You know, due to the massive reconfiguration of the political economy, these new emerging groups must include the resettled farmers in the countryside, your informal small-scale miners, your informal traders, small-scale business operators, and the new generation across gender, political parties, geography, ethnicity, color, and creed. And I agree with you, Dr. Mrisi, that there is need for citizenship and broader participation in all this. Civil society must also continue to watch those in power and those who want to take it. Those in power and those who want to take it, they must make them to account. Even the private sector that Joy Mabenge was talking about earlier on. But first, civil society must itself be accountable and also exercise the ghost of power for the sake of power from its psyche in their internal spaces. Such psyche has led in some instances to fissures, factions, corruption, clouded thinking, and paralysis. But how shall we expect accountability from others when we are unaccountable to ourselves? Accounting begins at home, I think. Finally, I just want to emphasize that the cultural domination of the will to power is one of Zimbabwe's fundamental problems today, and CSOs do not exist in a vacuum. This is manifested in the conflated articulation and practice of national politics by political parties, civil society, and other various actors. This has resulted in missing the fundamental basis of remaking the state and the nation post-opposition defeat in July 2013 general elections. And the new order should be premised on building inclusive political and economic institutions with the full participation of citizens for sustainable transformation. Let me emphasize that the path to transform is a long-winded process. But history has proven more often than not that there is no shortcut to building durable democracy, and Zimbabwe is unlikely to be an exception, no matter how upset and angry we are. As Dumiso Dabengwa, the president of ZAPU, has consistently argued, I quote, "We need to change the system first and foremost, more than we just need to change the person." Close quote, and I thank you.